Balatro is a roguelike deck-building game developed by a single person that has taken the gaming community by storm, including me. I had already put my fair share of time into it earlier this year, as the game sunk its claws into me and refused to let go for many hours. This means a lot because I'm honestly not much of a deck-building kind of person, so the fact that I was so hooked speaks to the immensely gratifying experience the game offers. The quick pace of the gameplay loop and the explosion of instant gratification you get from a good hand, combined with strong joker cards, is something that gets the dopamine engine running. The last time I was so hooked on such a simple and straightforward indie game was Vampire Survivors, which, coincidentally, is sort of like the slot machine to Balatro's poker. Balatro first made waves when it came out in February 2024, when roguelike enthusiasts were the first to sink their teeth into the game, and word began to spread from there. Slowly but surely, this modest indie title gained more and more traction, being praised left and right for its simple but highly addictive premise of taking regular poker hands and adding a huge selection of random joker cards with different gameplay-changing effects to maximize your winnings. The game's popularity exploded even more when it finally hit Android and iOS in September that same year, which meant people could now take this digital crack on the go. In the recent Game Awards 2024, Balatro took home 3 awards: Best Mobile Game, Best Debut Indie Game, and Best Independent Game, and was nominated for Best Game Direction and Game of the Year on top of that. With all this crazy reception and 3.5 million sales to boot, calling Balatro a success would be an understatement, especially when its one and only creator, who goes by Local Thunk, intended for the game to only be shared among his group of friends. It sounds like a story that is suited for a happy ending, and it is mostly getting one. But there is one thorn that has been stuck in Local Thunk's side for the entire time the game has been out, and that is the PEGI ratings board. Now, for those who don't know, PEGI, which stands for Pan-European Games Information, is the European video game content rating system, similar to North America's ESRB or Japan's SERO. Some of you might be thinking, hold on, Balatro's not M-rated here in America, is it? If it's not, then surely PEGI wouldn't give it a rating like that either. And yeah, under normal circumstances, you would be correct. Balatro contains no adult content whatsoever. No violence, no swearing, no nudity, no allusion to drinking or doing drugs. Nothing. It's just good old roguelike card playing. Despite that, PEGI saw fit to slam the game with an absurd PEGI 18 rating. Now, why the hell would they do that, I hear you ask? Well, the PEGI website does offer a bit of an explanation, saying this about the gambling label for their ratings board. The game contains elements that encourage or teach gambling. These simulations of gambling refer to games of chance that are normally carried out in casinos or gambling halls. Some older titles can be found with PEGI 12 or PEGI 16, but PEGI changed the criteria for this classification in 2020, which made that new games with this sort of content are always PEGI 18. Basically, PEGI's primary concern is gambling in the game being realistic enough to be considered a teaching tool, which is flimsy reasoning in itself because many games commonly associated with gambling can still be played without actually gambling anything. Either way, this seems pretty cut and dry considering they changed their criteria in 2020 and state as much. But, as Local Thunk would later mention, the issue here is not the fact that Balatro is rated 18. It's the hypocrisy and double standards shown by PEGI when they refuse to give other games an 18 rating despite having real gambling in the form of loot boxes or microtransactions you spend real money on, such as EA Sports FC, which has a PEGI 3 rating even though the game has macro transactions going up to $150 for points to spend on player packs with randomized content. But Balatro has none of this stuff. In fact, its normal, non-discounted price is only $14.99, which makes this one of the best games you can possibly get for the price, because of how incredibly addicting it is. Not only that, but the game has gotten multiple free cosmetic content updates that change the appearance of cards. Only one of these games contains actual gambling, and it sure isn't Balatro. Now, for full context, this battle with the PEGI ratings board did not start recently. It actually started back on March 1st, right around the time Balatro first came out. The game's publisher, PlayStack, released an announcement on Twitter saying that PEGI had suddenly changed the game's rating from 3 to 18 without any warning, causing the game to be removed from various online storefronts in certain countries. So not only is Balatro saddled with a rating it doesn't deserve, PEGI had already given the game a more reasonable rating first, but changed it after the fact without even telling PlayStack, thus taking access to the game away from hopeful players in some areas. And because PEGI did it without notifying either PlayStack or LocalThunk, neither of them were given the chance to make any sort of appeal. The PlayStack announcement goes on to state that Balatro doesn't encourage gambling, and in fact, great care was taken by LocalThunk to not include gambling mechanics. Now, this might sound strange at first because it's a poker game that rewards you based on how good your hand is and how strong your jokers are. But it is actually true that the game does not include any gambling, because the player does not risk any currency themselves while playing. You can only gain currency by achieving the score needed to progress, which is then spent on other cards, and this is basically how every roguelike game plays. You, the player, never forks over or wages any chips yourself just to begin playing, and this goes against both the definition and spirit of gambling. If you're losing anything, it's just hours of your time. But apparently that's not enough for PEGI, who see the game as a training simulator for gambling anyway, even though poker can absolutely be played at home with friends without making any type of wagers at all. Just because gambling is associated with poker doesn't mean gambling is crucial to the mechanics of the game. PEGI has shown hypocrisy and inconsistency on this entire crusade against simulated gambling multiple times. Back in 2019, NBA 2K20 was in hot water for having roulette, slots, and pachinko minigames in its My Team mode, but still got a PEGI 3 rating in spite of that, and PEGI's defense was that 2K20's portrayal is not realistic enough to teach or encourage gambling, even though those games were all luck-based and require pushing a single button or pulling a lever. The only thing Balatro teaches is what poker hands look like and arguably how probability works, but that's really just mathematics, not gambling. Now, some of you might say, but PEGI's strictness only started in 2020. And that is true, so let's take a look at a 2020 game. Clubhouse Games 51 Worldwide Classics, a game on the Switch that features 51 card and board games. It released in June 5th, 2020, the middle of the year, and it has Blackjack and Texas Hold'em in it. And even though PEGI outright states on their own website that content like this would always get PEGI 18 ratings starting in 2020, Clubhouse Games still got a PEGI 12. And we're still not done. Back in 2021, PEGI also clarified that old games that featured gambling but still received a rating of PEGI 12 or below would not have their ratings increased to PEGI 18 if they were re-released to modern platforms. So, PEGI suddenly has integrity when it comes to not changing ratings, but throws it out when it comes to changing Balatro's rating back in February without notifying PlayStack. LocalThunk has very recently taken to Twitter to rightfully air his grievances over the situation. As I mentioned before, he would compare the rating his game received to EA Sports FC, stating, "Since PEGI gave us an 18+ rating for having evil playing cards, maybe I should add microtransactions/loot boxes/real gambling to lower that rating to 3+ like EA Sports FC." This tweet got a lot of attention and voices of support, and LocalThunk was able to speak to the organization again, but talks remained unsuccessful. He later said, Talked with PEGI and they do not see anything wrong with Balatro being rated 18+, nor with EA Sports FC and similar games having a 3+ rating. Blaming EU laws, blaming storefronts, waiting for the future. Sitting on their hands. I thought some good might come of this. This sucks. So, it seems unlikely PEGI will bother reverting Balatro back to its much more reasonable rating of PEGI 3, despite games with actual gambling mechanics requiring real money also getting away with a PEGI 3. While the desire to prevent gambling being exposed to younger audiences isn't a bad goal in itself, PEGI is going about it in a totally ass-backwards way that clearly isn't really helping. The biggest perpetrators, which are big AAA sports games, are getting out unscathed while the unassuming indie title is taking all the hits. PEGI is hypocritical, inconsistent, and have blatant double standards. How can PEGI be so staunchly anti-gambling when submitting a game to be rated by them is such a crapshoot? Maybe with enough pressure they can still change their minds, but who knows? This concludes my thoughts on the Balatro versus PEGI situation. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.